history briefly, and to say a few words about past equity struggles and try to provide the context that a historian can provide for the critical conversations that I think everyone here is committed to having in 2019 and beyond. I want to make a pitch for the importance of San Jose's history and for the importance of history generally for any considerations of public policy, for community building, and all the great work that those in city government are undertaking now and in the future. I think we still know too little about San Jose's history, and some of the reason we know so little about San Jose's history is because I think it's somewhat baked into the culture of this area to continue moving forward, to think about the next thing, to rush forward into the future. But I think the past in this area is important, and that we don't do ourselves and our communities a service if we only look to the entrepreneurs, the forward thinkers, the visionaries, and avoid thinking about the everyday people and those whose lives have been shaped by a lack of equity or even the presence of discrimination over time. I would suggest, based on my historical research, that issues of race have been actually central to San Jose's identity and to the social and political dynamics that have shaped life in this valley over the last 200 years. And that it's important to know San Jose's history if we want to think about issues of equity and our next steps. History, I think, is both the foundation and the framework in which we live today, and it provides the ways in which we can see what's going on around us and imagine better futures for everybody. In my reading, San Jose's government, San Jose's civic leaders didn't really move forward energetically on equity issues in any substantive way until the 1970s and the 1980s, which on the one hand gives us some history of doing so, but on the other I think is important to say that San Jose was later in getting to these issues than many other cities around the country. There are, of course, multiple histories that need to be thought about when we think about this area. And to my mind, dominant versions of history of what the San Jose is can sometimes obscure other critical histories that are equally important for the shaping of this area. Sometimes we talk about, for example, the Spaniards who brought civilization to this region. That's a version of history. The valley as an idyllic land for family farmers in the 19th century. That's a version of history. The immigrants who supposedly assimilated seamlessly into regional society 100 years ago. Another version of history. The ways in which middle-class families made this place a land of opportunity in the 1940s and the 1950s. The sense that the tech revolution based here was a product of individual genius. That's a version of history. Or that San Jose has become an ever more liberal, ever more welcoming place for everybody over the last 50 years. I think that historical evidence would suggest that we need to complicate all of those narratives and think more deeply about all of those as we think about how to actually understand this place. So let me start by saying that I think it's critical, for one thing, to remember the valley's history in the mid and late 19th century as this place became part of the United States in the aftermath of the Mexican War. That as an American town, this place was profoundly shaped by gold rush dynamics, by manifest destiny, and by a drive to develop farming industries that would privilege white Americans and not Native peoples and not people of Mexican descent. In fact, that foundational era of Valley history was structured by the displacement and disenfranchisement of previous landowners, particularly Mexicans and Mexican Americans, who were defrauded and denied their rights in post-1848 California. Economic growth in the early years of San Jose's existence as part of the United States was pursued in the name of anti-Native, anti-Mexican racism, and also of anti-Catholic sentiments. So if we're going to talk about the history of San Jose from these moments forward, we have to acknowledge, I think, that white supremacy was a key factor during that period and might at least possibly have continued to be important into the 20th century. The city's founding framers, the city and county officials in that period, its farmers, its other elites, its regional boosters were not innocents in this period. Powerful people sent San Jose residents of color and immigrants and others to jail on anti-vagrancy charges, turned them into indentured workers before and after the American Civil War. White people commonly called themselves farmers to distinguish themselves from peons in this area. Farmer was a racial code word in the 19th century that was intended to distinguish people from indolent, lazy racial others, and to define Latinos and others in this area as people who were suited for menial labor but not entitled to full citizenship. If we're going to think about San Jose's history and the history of equity, we should also remember that San Joseans developed systems of racial violence in the 19th century that targeted Mexicans and others in the valley. Lynchings were not uncommon in this place 150 years ago. Mexicans were criminalized and labeled monsters or labeled tigers in the 19th century in ways that sounds a little bit like the super predator language, so-called, of the 1990s. This was foundational to this area. This region created legal double standards that sent through the justice system that sent Mexicans to their deaths in court trials on murder charges, but sent very similar white defendants to jail on short prison terms who faced merely manslaughter charges. This area saw the development and maintenance of a justice system in the 19th century that had no Mexicans on its grand juries until after 1900, that had no Mexicans serving as sheriffs or justices of the peace or police officers during that era, and that actually trumpeted the disfranchisement and the dislocation of those people. I like to tell the story of Antonio Chaboya,